In this video, I will compare Blender's cycles with the newly released V-Ray for Blender. For this, I will pick 5 areas and then compare both engines in terms of features, workflow, or usability. With the release of V-Ray for Blender, the software now has access to a well-established, industry-standard, production-proven renderer with a long history. In this video, as a long-term V-Ray user, I want to share 5 examples where I believe V-Ray outperforms Cycles. This is by no means a complete list, just 5 areas where I personally feel Cycles is lacking. And if you agree or disagree or want to start a discussion, feel free to join the conversation in the comments below. If you'd like to try V-Ray for yourself, you can download a 30-day trial along with some sample scenes to see if it fits your workflow. But now, without any further ado, let's take a look at the 5 areas where I think V-Ray shines compared to Cycles. So Cycles itself doesn't really come with their own native frame buffer. You basically just render directly in your Blender viewport. And while this looks nice because it's neatly integrated here with the user interface, it has some issue. Mainly that you're bound to the size of your window in here, and in the end also to the resolution of your monitor. And also, since it's just a standard viewport here, it doesn't really give you a lot of tools or benefits which can help you with your rendering. So the only tool that is basically provided is that you can render a simple region, but then you throw away the entirety of the image, and it's difficult to judge that in the context. You also can't really have more than one region and so on, so it's kind of basic, and in my opinion a big disadvantage compared to V-Ray that comes with its own frame buffer. Now let's check this out and see what you're missing here in Cycles. So using V-Ray, you have a choice. You can either render directly in the native viewport, so let's do that now. And you can see our image just appears here in the viewport. We also have the same tools like what we have in Cycles. We can use this region rendering and so on. But the real power of using V-Ray comes from using the frame buffer. So let's just stop this rendering here. And instead, let's now use the V-Ray frame buffer. And this we can summon by pressing on this button up here. So let's do that. And then our scene here will immediately start to render. So the V-Ray frame buffer is great because it gives you quick access to all of the necessary tools that you need for rendering. And for now, let's just stop the rendering and let's start here on the left-hand side. You can see we have here this list with different images. We can add our most recent rendering by just pressing on this button in here. You can see that now our rendering appears here in this list. We can then check out different images here and see how they look like, or we just jump back to our original image and we can then use this comparison feature. So we can compare, for example, those 2 images, and you can swipe back and forth between them and see what is changing. You can say, for example, different kind of lighting configuration. You can also easily zoom in your image here and then compare this in detail and so on. So this is also a really, really great feature in here. Next on the list is here by far one of my most used feature, the drop-down list for the render elements. You can check your alpha channel, your denoise result, your lighting, your global illumination, refraction, and all your other passes which you set up. So this is super handy, and you can see you can easily scroll through them by using the mouse wheel. And that's definitely a feature I would never want to miss because it helps you tackle down some issues. You can check if some render problems come from, for example, the bump maps or from the refraction and so on. And it helps you to easily tackle down issues that you might have in your rendering. Here you can also choose different channels to preview, and normally, of course, this should be set to all the 3 channels. And here you can also easily quickly switch to the alpha channel of your image. Let's now start the rendering again because I want to show you the options that we have for rendering regions. That would be this button up here. Once you click this, you can see you have a region that you can freely position here on your image. You can change the size and so on. So let's position this here on the house, for example. And off screen, I will now change the color of the house. And you can see this only updates now the part of the region. And you will also notice that it doesn't really throw away the other part of the image. So you can see everything here in context and not like in the Blender viewport where you basically just crop out this part and you can't really see anything around it. You can then move this, for example, a little bit to the side. And let's say we change the color here again, for example, to this kind of bluish color. And you can also then move your region around, and it will update then here this area which you want to see. So those will be the simple regions, but you also have here the polygon region renders. And for this, you can even draw some shape. So let's say, for example, you don't want to waste any precious render power. You're just gonna put this here exactly around the house. Then you can just render this part in here, and that's, I think, also a very nice feature. You can even add multiple regions by just right-clicking. Let's say we want another rectangular region around this tree, and then another freeform region around, for example, this tree here at the bottom. And then once we do changes, it will update all of those 3 parts in here. Let me just do some changes. At the moment, I'm changing just the shader of the house, but you can see all of the other parts here are also updated. And I think that's really a great feature and something that I haven't really seen in any other render engine so far. Now we can just disable the region and we can just save that in our history. And if we want to, we can now compare both of those images and see which version we prefer in here. So overall, those are already quite a nice selections of very handy tools. So let's take a look on how Cycles handles tone mapping. And for now, I switched off the tone mapping that you can find here in the color management tab. And this is basically the linear data that's actually being rendered. The problem is it looks quite ugly. You have these kind of like clipping highlights. You have these oversaturated, unnatural colors and so on. And that's why you need to enable tone mapping to have it look correctly on your monitor, so to speak. So in Cycles, I said this is done here in this color management tab. And I think nowadays you normally use this 𝐘𝐸 or Filmic. And this is kind of a Blender internal tone map, which is not really supported by many other software. And additionally, you have also the option to add some kind of looks to it. I think in this scene here, I had this very high contrast look. You can see it just increases the contrast. And you have additional options to play here with the exposure or with the gamma. And while those options here are quite nice, it's actually fairly limited if you compare that to what V-Ray has to offer. Then, of course, in Blender, you also have the compositor. And this is a super powerful feature that enables you to really do compositing similar like you would do in some proprietary software like Nuke and so on. But from my feeling, it can easily get over complex just to achieve some very simple effects in here. So for example, these are all the nodes that I had to assemble just to get a simple vignette effect here. Or if you just want to have a little bit of glare and so on, it can easily get kind of complex and is maybe less of an artist-friendly approach to get the final end result. So in my opinion, V-Ray finds a better balance between complexity and artist-friendliness. And I'm also going to show you this in a second. So here in V-Ray, if we switch to the Globals tab here, you can see there's also a color management tab. And here you can only define the rendering color space. You have the choice between sRGB and ACES. And ACES is an industry standard color space, which is supported by a wide range of different softwares. So this is also one great option here in V-Ray, but let's not overcomplicate things for now. Let's just stick with sRGB for now. And the question is, how can we set up our tone mapping? So let's render here in the viewport. Let me just disable here the overlays. And you can see we have similar issues like what we had in Blender when we rendered without the 𝐘𝐸 or Filmic tone map, and that we have these kind of like clipping brightness values here. We have these unnaturally flat and in some parts oversaturated colors. And this is always a sign that tone mapping is not enabled. So in V-Ray, you don't really set that up here in the render settings. You set that up in the frame buffer directly. So let's open up the frame buffer and see what options we have in here. So now we're back in the frame buffer, and what I haven't showed you yet is everything here on the right hand side. And this is where all of the tone mapping would be set up, and you can even set up some compositing and effects. So let's deal with the tone mapping first. So inside here you have different kind of layers, and it works similar like in Photoshop. So they are just stacked on top of each other. So here as a base we have our source RGB, and then these 3 standard effects, which I disabled for now so that we don't get confused. And now the first step we want to do is to set up some basic tone mapping in order to get nicer color tones here in our image. There are various ways to set this up. We can just right click here, add a new layer. And the by far easiest way is to just add here this Filmic tone map. And once you do this, you can see we immediately have nicer colors. Let me just hide and unhide this. you can see we don't really have this completely burned out color tones in here. And this is now handled by the tone mapping. So if you ever feel your renderings in Cycles look nicer out of the box compared to V-Ray, that's because Blender has by default here this tone mapping enabled. And for V-Ray, you have to enable this manually for some reason. And similar like in Blender, you have different types of tone mappings available. So in Blender, this would be AGX and Filmic, for example. Here you have those ones, and they have different type of controls, and some of them give you really a huge amount of controls. We can use this power curve here, for example, and then just dial in these settings exactly how we want to. We can define the contrast and play around with this until we get something that looks quite nice as a starting point. So this one here would be the white point. Let me just place this a little bit back. And I think like this is a good starting point. So my goal with this would be to make kind of a nighttime shot here out of this. So let's go inside and add a white balance. And let's just place this before our tone mapping. So let's play here with the white balance, for example. And the order here is important. So for example, if I add an exposure node, normally it's added here at the end of a chain. And for the exposure, for example, if I dial down the exposure, you can see that all of my highlights here, they would turn grayish. And that's because it's happening after the tone mapping. So what you have to do is to put this in front of the tone mapping. And then you can see you have the correct brightness values here and correct color values here maintained, and it's not really turning to gray. And then I think like this, we can have a quite nice result. Let's do, for example, something like this. And I also want to add some effects. So we first can enable here our denoiser. So if I zoom in, you can see it's actually still quite noisy. I can enable here the denoiser, and you can see this helps to get rid of a noise. And you can even define the blending. So here the noise would be completely removed, and here it's starting to come back. So let's just use it up to, for example, like this here. So we still have some of subtle noise, and we can also enable here some lens effects, for example. So you can see this helps here to make the screen look much more shiny. So on and off. And there's tons of different options that you can set up here and define the look of your lens effects. We can even add some vignette effects, for example. So let's just add this, place this in front of our filmic tone map, and then with these handles here, define the look and the opacity of this. And I think like this, it looks quite nice. Let's make this a little bit more bluish and play a bit with the exposure and with the intensity here of the vignette. And I think like this, we have quite a nice looking nighttime shot here. So the frame buffer also supports various masking techniques, including the very powerful crypto mattes, which I rendered out here for this image. So you can see I have a crypto matte for all of the parts here of my image. Let's go back to our RGB color. Let's say I want to add some localized adjustments. So let me add here, for example, this hue and saturation. And let's say I want to change here the hue of my image. And let's say I want to have this kind of like bluish purple color on those wing caps, but not on the whole image, of course, because that looks horrible. So let me just add here a new crypto matte mask. You can see that now these adjustments disappear because I have to define now in what area they should happen. So I can use here my crypto mask, and I can pick the different parts of my image. So I can use this wing cap, and I can use that wing cap. And you can see then these adjustments here are only happening on those wing caps. And this is super powerful, as you can see, and enables you quickly to do some localized adjustments here on your image. Once you've finished all your color adjustments, you can then also right click here and save all the color corrections as a lookup table file. So you can bring your linear renderings over to, for example, Nuke or DaVinci Resolve, and then use the settings that you set up here in your V-Ray frame buffer as a starting point in those software, and then further define or fine tune it over there. So this should serve as a fast overview over the V-Ray tone mapping and compositing. And this is more complex than I can show in this quick segment here. The point I'm trying to make is that even though Blender has its very powerful compositor, it's also extremely complex. And even to add just a few color corrections and effects, it requires a quite complex setup. And you saw how fast that was here to set this up to get a finalized result. And we're even able to just shift this off to a different software and continue it over there. Another great feature in V-Ray is the light mix. And yes, as a disclaimer, you can also set up something like this in Blender using the compositor. But again, here my point is on how easy and well integrated this is. So you just enable the light mix and then you can just define here the settings. So in my case, I grouped all of the different lights here already in different groups. So I will just choose to go by group lights. And now we can just start the rendering and see what we get. So this scene here is quite heavy. As you can see, it uses volumetric. So this is always quite a heavy thing to render. And if I would now tweak my lights in my scene, let's say I would want to change the color of this light and so on here, it would take a really long time. So what Light Mix offers me to do is to do basically those tweaks here in a compositing type of way. So it doesn't need to recalculate your image, but at the same time, I'm already able to switch here and change those settings of those lights. For example, I can turn off the light here for our UFO. I can change a different color. Let's use, for example, kind of this bluish color or this kind of greenish color and so on. We are really able to, let's say, define exactly how we want this to look like, change the saturation, change here our warmth, and so on. You can see you can get lots of different effects here, and you can really tweak that for all of the lights in your scene. For example, here I have some light in the chimney. Let me just boost this up a lot so you can see now how this is affecting my scene. And let's say I want to make this very bluish, increase the saturation, and so on. You can see you can tweak this however you want. And you can even change your environment lights. For example, I want to have this overall more bright or more dark, for example, and get different type of effects and looks in here. And all of this completely in real time without having to actually change my lights and redo the entire rendering here, basically. You can also define the strengths of your self-illumination materials. So let me just disable this, for example. Or let me just make those less strong, let's say 0.3 or something. And you can see this also updates then the glare effects because those are layered here on top of this. And then depending on how strong you make this, you can see your glare effects become much stronger. So everything is kind of updating in the correct way, how it should be like. And now let's see, we can also choose here, for example, these small lights here on the UFO. Let me just disable those, or let me just make them stronger here. And as you can see, this affects the entire fog, it affects the entire scene. It's really the same like if you would change those lights here in your actual scene, and you would get basically the same kind of result in here, just like this. You have it completely in real time, and it's a very artist-friendly way to tweak and define your scene. Again, as said in cycles, this is also possible. It just requires a lot more setup and is much more technically complex than just doing it like this way, how V-Ray handles this. So in Blender Cycles, HDRI Lighting is not a simple light source that you would add in your scene, but instead it's handled through the world environment. So for this, you would need to go inside here and set up an HDRI texture and then just connect that into your world output. And once you do this, you can see you have some nice HDRI lighting in your scene. And this is fine for basics, but you quickly run into issues if you really want to integrate your object, because as you can see, this light source here is infinitely far away. So if I zoom in and out, my object here is kind of like floating in place. It's not really connected here with our environment. You also don't really have any floor shadows and so on. And while all of this is fixable, and let me just unhide this geometry here, where you then can see that, yeah, now it is possible. So I zoom in and out and everything is neatly integrated. We have some nice shadows and so on. But the way to achieve this is to basically project your HDRI onto a new geometry, set up some quite complex shading setup here in order to basically make all of this work. And yeah, as said, it's possible, but it's not really the fastest approach here to handle this. And I thought we can now check out how V-Ray handles the same task and see how fast that goes. If you're interested on how to achieve this kind of effect here in Blender Cycles, you're lucky I have my own dedicated video also that you can find in my channel. So now we're in V-Ray, and contrary to Cycles, V-Ray handles the same task here by having its own dedicated light source. That would be the V-Ray Dome Light. So let me just add this into the scene. And now we can just select it and add our HDRI texture map inside by just adding a V-Ray bitmap into our scene. And now just selecting our HDRI texture and then connecting this here into our dome color. So you can see if we do this, we have basically the same result that we have in Blender. So this light source here is infinitely far away, and we can zoom in and out, and our object is kind of floating in place here. So now let's check out how we can integrate this here better so that our objects are neatly embedded into our environment. So for this, the dome light provides a very nice trick, and that is the option to make it into a so-called finite dome. Let me just enable this here. You can see something is changing. Let me just hide here the overlays. And now our object seems to be standing already on some kind of surface. You can see I can move the camera in and out, but it doesn't really look like much because we still have to set it up correctly. But let me just zoom all the way out, and you can see that now here our HDRI was projected on this kind of dome geometry here in our scene. We can then set this up by changing the size here of our scene. I think a value of 20 works fine. The projection height, so that it basically defines where we have our floor plane. In this case, let's use a value of 2. And what we can also change here is the shape of our dome. And I think in this case, let's also use here a value of 0.2. And now if we zoom inside our scene, you can see that our object here is quite nicely standing here on this floor plane, and it looks really nicely integrated. So now the only thing which are missing are shadows. You can see there's no shadows here at the moment. This is easily fixed by just adding a simple floor geometry here. And then in the object properties, there's the V-Ray object properties. We can make this into a matte surface. If we enable this, you can see it disappears here from our view. It's still visible in the reflections. So it's still in the scene, but in order to make the shadows appear, we have to enable this shadows option. At this time, the shadows appear. Now we only need to take care about our reflections here. You can see it still shows up in the reflections. And for this, let's just select it again and then go in this option and just choose to use our V-Ray Dome Light here also for the reflections. And then it shows up perfectly together with the shadows. We have the reflection of the shadows from the floor, and everything is now really perfectly integrated. And contrary to Blender Cycles, it only took a few seconds to set this here up. So finally, let's talk about the nodes in the shader editor. And here I want to choose a very simple example and then see how both Cycles and Blender handle the same task. And in this case here, we have a simple plane with a texture map. And you can see the pattern here is repeating itself. And this, of course, in computer graphics is very ugly because it immediately tells you that this is a computer generated image. So normally you would want to randomize here the texture repetition. So in this case, let's say we want to rotate each texture tile here in 90-degree steps, so that we break up here this repeating pattern. So here I prepared a setup already. Let's connect that now into the vector here. And you can see this does now exactly what we want. We don't really have this repeating pattern anymore. We randomly rotate here all of our texture tiles in 90-degree steps. So the result is nice, but the problem is that the setup to achieve this here is extremely complicated. I can't even take credit for this because honestly, I simply don't really understand what's going on. There's a lot of math and so on involved in order to get the output here. And I just downloaded this preset here from a forum, and I'm sure it took quite a bit of effort and brain juice to produce. So for me as an artist, I don't really want to deal with some vector math nodes and so on in order to just reach a very simple result. So V-Ray, I think in that regard is much better because it gives you pre-built tools that handle all of those frequent reoccurring tasks. So you can just focus on building instead of figuring out the math for some very complicated setup. So now using V-Ray, we have the same starting situation. We have this plane here with this repeating texture tiles, and V-Ray provides their own node for this in order to randomize your UVWs, and that is the V-Ray UVW randomizer. So this would be placed between your mapping and your texture map, and once this is in place, you can see something is happening already. We would then need to go in our settings, and then we have a lot of options here how we can randomize our UVs. So since we want to randomize each UV tile, we would need to enable here stochastic tiling. And now you can see that each of our UV tiles here has a completely random offset and a completely random rotation. You also have access to this tile blend parameter here, and here you can blend between those different tiles. And this is very useful for some organic texture, so you can easily fill up a huge area without visible texture repetitions. In our case, we have these very defined tiles, so let's disable here the tile blend. And now let's go for the texture variance. And at the moment, each tile here is rotating between 0 and 360 degrees. And here we can also define the rotation steps. So in our case, we only want to have 4 steps so that we only rotate in 90 degrees increments. And then something similar we also want to do for the offset. So at the moment, the offset on the U and the V tiles is between 0 and 1, so full offset. But now let's define the steps by 3 because we have 3 by 3 tiles in each UV. So let's put 3 in the U steps and the V steps. And just like this, we achieved here our final result. Now you can see that each of our UV tiles has a completely unique offset and a completely unique rotation. And we're easily able to tweak this here with our UVW randomizer node. So this, of course, is just a small example, but it stands a little bit for the different philosophies of those two different renderers. So in Cycles, you have a lot of very basic nodes that you can combine in endless possibilities. You can really build some very complex tools. And in V-Ray, it's a little bit more streamlined to what artists actually need. And in my experience, this covers like 99% of all of the use cases, at least in my work. And I much rather like to prefer to use some ready-made tools instead of combining lots of small nodes together, having to know some complicated math and so on, just to achieve some very simple and basic results. This concludes my selected comparison between both render engines. If you want to try out V-Ray for yourself, you can download a 30-day trial together with some scene files and see if it fits your workflow. Make sure to subscribe to this channel to get more content for V-Ray for Blender. Otherwise, see you next tutorial. Take care and see you soon.